Global Agenda is supported by the World Affairs Council of Wilmington and the University of Delaware. Thanks to the university's Center for International Studies, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and the Department of Communication. And as I've noted before, this year also thanks to the Muslim Students Association here at UD and the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Delaware, who are also co-sponsoring Global Agenda. Now, because you're all here tonight, I suspect you're already following news about the Middle East, and this week has already been a big week. President Obama just met with a Middle East leader for the first time since moving into the White House, Jordan's King Abdullah. And the White House says Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas are also getting invitations to come to Washington, as is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, all of them within the next 6 weeks. It's actually a typical start to a new U.S. administration to meet with Middle East leaders, all of whom want to know where they stand with the United States. By the way, I'd like to note that Jordan's King Abdullah visited Delaware on a motorcycle before his appointment at the White House. King Abdullah was actually the first guest I invited to this year's Global Agenda series, and I don't mind saying I'm a little disappointed that he chose to come to Delaware but declined UD's invitation to speak. Maybe another time. The reason all those leaders are just now getting their invitations to meet with President Obama is that the United States never wants to engage with Middle East leaders without being able to include the Prime Minister of Israel. And the Israeli government has been quite uncertain for several weeks since Israel's narrow election. But now Israel has a coalition government, and Mr. Netanyahu, I'm sure, will accept Mr. Obama's invitation. So, as we reporters used to say who covered the Middle East, the bazaar is officially open. Also this week, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad gave another humdinger of a speech at the United Nations Conference on Racism in Geneva. His rant against Israel sent European friends of Israel streaming out of the room and prompted the usually even-handed UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to denounce the Iranian leader's remarks. The United States never even attended the conference, anticipating the anti-Israeli focus. In our Global Agenda series so far this spring, we've heard from an Egyptian journalist who reported from Israel and all around the Arab world, from a Lebanese-Jordanian analyst who has spent his career writing about the Arab-Israeli conflict, from an American diplomat who deals daily with the Arab world and who worked at the U.S. Embassy in Israel, and from a New York Times reporter covering the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So now it's important to hear from the Israelis. There's a common joke among Israelis, and actually among Jews generally. The joke says that if you ask 3 Israelis for their opinions, you'll get 4 opinions. Which is to say that just as our previous speakers have revealed about the Arab world, the Israelis are not monolithic either. And I'm really pleased to announce tonight that our next speaker in the Global Agenda series will be an official representative of the new Israeli government, the Consul General of Israel in Philadelphia, Honorable Daniel Kuttner. I'll tell you more about him at the end of tonight's program. Our speaker tonight is Tom Segev, one of Israel's most respected and prolific historians. Tom was born in Jerusalem in 1945, and he still lives there. He earned his BA degree in history and political science at the Hebrew University and his PhD in history at Boston University. He's the author of 6 books about the history of Israel, whose titles say a lot about his extensive interests. Commanders of the Nazi concentration camps and the 7th Million connect the birth of Israel to the Holocaust and World War II. One Palestine Complete covers the period just before the creation of Israel, between the exodus of Jews from Europe to the birth of Israel in 1948. The First Israelis documents the lives of Jews who created and built the Israeli nation. 1967, Israel, the war, and the year that transformed the Middle East is completely self-explanatory. Elvis in Jerusalem describes what Tom calls the Americanization of Israel. He's just finished a 7th book, a biography of Holocaust investigator Simon Wiesenthal, which will be published later this year. And Tom writes a widely read and highly respected weekly column for Haaretz, Israel's largest daily newspaper. Tom and I first met in 1991. We were both in Madrid as journalists. We were covering the first Arab-Israeli face-to-face peace conference, including all the Arab states. The Madrid conference was a byproduct of the 1991 Gulf War coalition against Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Tom reminded me that we met sitting on a bench outside the Madrid Conference Center where the historic talks were about to begin. He and I, and just one other journalist, had drawn lucky straws to be included in the small press pool of reporters allowed inside the first session of the talks, when the Arabs and Israelis would actually sit down together around the table for the first time. No, they didn't shake hands. Almost 2 decades later, Tom and I are still waiting for the Arabs and the Israelis to make peace. Please welcome Tom Segev to the University of Delaware.
Thank you very much. When I told my son that I've been invited to talk about understanding Israel, he said, well, this will be a very short talk. You tell the people that it can't be done and send them home. Actually, I'm not sure what's the more difficult thing to do, to understand the Arabs, as you tried to do some time ago, or understanding the Israelis. Understanding the Israelis is very, very difficult, and explaining Israelis is very difficult. One reason being that we don't understand ourselves. We can't even agree on who is a Jew, big issue in Israel. We are a very diverse society. We are a deeply divided society, and almost everything you say about Israelis is equally true and untrue. I assume that we won't go home tonight before mentioning the peace process. Put a big question mark behind these words. Also, I don't know if you expect to leave here tonight more optimistic or more pessimistic than you were when you came in. I can do both. Which means, of course, that everything is open, and I want you not to expect to hear all the answers from me, and least of all, I don't want you to expect me to tell you what will happen. I'm always wrong when I predict. But what I would like to do for a change is to talk about the reasons why it is so difficult to understand Israelis. We are ending next week 60 years of independence, and perhaps you should think of me as an American who was sent to explain America 60 years after the declaration of American independence. 60 years is not a very long time in nation building. Still, I think that at this point, it is not difficult to argue that Israel constitutes one of the most fantastic success stories of the 20th century. Making that argument requires that I repeat some historical cliches, but it turns out that at least some national mythology has at least a grain of truth in it. The very existence of the State of Israel, living from war to war, cannot be taken for granted. Again and again, we went through large wars, and in between them, we experienced many outbreaks of violence, like the most recent one in Gaza, and Israel survived them all. Israel is the home for Jews. It is the result of a dream that lasted for 2,000 years. People from 100 countries, speaking 100 languages, came to Israel to build a new society. And 60 years later, that society is more or less democratic, more or less viable from an economic point of view. Take international statistics and compare them, and I mean statistics published by international organizations such as the UN, the World Health Organization, UNESCO, the World Bank. Statistics about quality of life, about health, child mortality, literacy, and things which can be compared. You can find lists like that on the internet. There will always be about 150 countries on that list, and Israel will always be among the top 15, which means that most Israelis enjoy better lives than most other people in the world. I think that most Israelis feel today that they have a common Israeli identity. And I say this in spite of the fact that we are so deeply divided. We are divided among the religious and the non-religious. We are divided among those people who originated in Europe and those who originated in Arab countries, and we are divided along other lines, and still most Israelis feel that they share a common identity. I think that the most important element of that identity is the Hebrew language. This is more important than actually living in Israel, because if somebody leaves Israel and opens a falafel stand here on campus, for example, he will still be an Israeli as long as he speaks Hebrew with his family. As long as his children speak Hebrew, they will still be Israelis. Other elements of the Israeli identity are, of course, the Jewish tradition, the Holocaust, as I will mention again later. And I think perhaps the most important thing about life in Israel is that most Israelis share a feeling which perhaps is the most important feeling of people towards a country anywhere, and that is that their children will have better lives in Israel than their own lives. I think that is something you can say about most Israelis, and I think these are some of the elements that make Israel what it is, as I said, a very dramatic success story. But Israel has changed over the years. I don't see you now at all because you're all in the dark, but before I noticed that there are some people here who probably grew up with that very heroic image of Israel which Leon Uris created for us in Exodus. In reality, this is not the same country anymore, and it is facing very grave problems. Social solidarity, which was once so typical for Israel, we were so proud of it, social justice, has made room for the American market economy. The symbol for Israeli social justice was the kibbutz, of course, the symbol for the Israeli ideal, for the Israeli dream. In reality, most kibbutzim, or the kibbutz as an ideal, does no longer exist. The kibbutz is dead. The Labour Party, which adopted social democratic ideals, the Labour Party is in effect dead. The Labour Party was responsible for the creation of Israel under David Ben-Gurion, and today hardly exists anymore. The deepest change, I think, in the Israeli society is that we have deep gaps between those who have and those who have nots. We now have, for the first time in Israel, very rich people, rich in international terms, and we have more poor people. than ever before. We have lots of homeless people in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem and in other places. And that is a relatively new experience to us. On the eve of Passover last week, in the evening, I heard an announcement on the radio directed to Holocaust survivors who don't have a hot meal. They were told that they can call a certain telephone number and volunteers will come and get them a hot meal, which you may describe as a wonderful sign for communal togetherness, but the real question is, why do we have Holocaust survivors who don't have a hot meal? We don't treat the elderly very well in Israel, and we don't treat Holocaust survivors very well. Why? Because they don't have a political lobby. That's the major reason. The level of education in Israel has dropped a lot. We still have very, very good schools. We still export thousands of electronic engineers to Silicon Valley in California, but we also have more poor schools than we ever had before. And the general level of education, I think, has come down. We were once very proud of our democratic awareness, and much of our democratic awareness has made room to political cynicism. General interest in politics has come down. Israel was once known as a country of newspaper readers. People would walk around with little transistor radios and had to listen to the news every hour. Israeli media today is much less political than it used to be. It's generally in other countries also, in this country also. It is more entertaining, less regards itself as a watchdog of democracy. People are less involved in politics, and what is, I think, the worst thing is that people no longer believe in politics. Unfortunately, they have good reason not to believe in politics. As you know, we have a prime minister who faces charges of corruption. We had a president who faces charges of rape. We have any other number of ministers, including a minister of finance, ministers of justice, who face all kinds of charges. And so the general belief is that it is not one politician or the other, it is the democratic system itself that is wrong. And that, again, is a relatively new phenomena, if you want, in Israel. And of course, it is a very dangerous thing in a country that is involved in such a dangerous conflict as we are, the conflict with the Palestinians. And just as people no longer believe in politics, no longer believe in the democratic system, most Israelis no longer today believe in peace. They want peace, they are willing to take the risks of peace, but they don't believe that peace is possible. And that is a very new development in Israel. We always used to say, yes, there will be peace. If you look at me, for example, I belong to a generation that grew up to believe that, yes, there will be peace, no question about it. If you had asked me 40 years ago, will we have peace in 2009, of course we will have peace, no question about it. If you ask young people today, do you think that in 40 years we will have peace? They will tell you no, we don't believe in it. And these two relatively new phenomena not believing in politics and not believing in peace, come together with a third relatively new experience for us, and that is bigotry and hatred. It is today legitimate to hate the Arabs. We used to say to ourselves that we don't hate. They hate us. We want peace. They hate us. Hatred was something we don't do. Hatred today has become legitimate, unfortunately, and it is directed very often not against the Arabs, the enemy, the Palestinians in the territories. It is directed very often against the Arabs of Israel. As you know, 1 in every 5 Israelis is an Arab, and we now have a party headed by Avigdor Lieberman, who is foreign minister in the new government, and that is a party that is basically based on bigotry and hatred to Israeli Arabs. One of the reasons why this happens is that this particular party is supported by a very large number of Russians who have come to Israel, Jews who have come to Israel from Russia, about 1 million people, and those people have not brought with them democratic values. So, in a situation where the democracy in Israel is weak, these people have joined us and they have not brought with them democratic values. Many of them, not all, but about 70% of those 1 million people have supported that new party headed by Lieberman. This is the situation as I see it today. I think the major reason why it is so difficult to understand Israel is because we are doing things which contradict our national interest. And we know it, and we do it anyway. In other words, we are captivated by irrational policies. Obviously, mainly the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. We do have a national aim in Israel, which has a constitutional definition. And that aim is to make Israel into a Jewish and democratic country. This is a definition. It appears in various laws, in various court decisions, a Jewish and democratic country. In order for Israel to be Jewish, it needs a Jewish majority. It cannot have a Jewish majority as long as it controls millions of Palestinians. It cannot be democratic as long as it controls and oppresses millions of Palestinians. So the rational conclusion is that we need to get out of the territories we occupied in 1967. If we go back for a minute to 1967, if we go back to 1967 for a minute, 6 months prior to the Six-Day War, senior government officials in Israel discussed the possibility that Israel will have to occupy the West Bank. For various reasons, if the Iraqis come in, if the Palestinians raise, if King Hussein falls, various possibilities why Israel may have to occupy the West Bank. And the bottom line of these discussions was that it is not in our interest to occupy the West Bank. Why? Because it will endanger the Jewish majority of Israel. Why? Because it will encourage Palestinian nationalism. Why? Because it will encourage Palestinian terrorism. So it is not in the national interest of Israel to occupy the West Bank. We should do everything we can in order not to occupy the West Bank. 6 months later, the Six-Day War broke out. All reason was forgotten. We occupy East Jerusalem, we occupy the West Bank. Now it is fascinating to see and read the minutes of the government of the meetings in which they made the decisions to occupy the West Bank, and particularly to occupy East Jerusalem. Why is it so fascinating? Because there are no position papers, no alternatives, no plans, nothing, no experts, no legal experts were called in to these discussions. If any one of you and I buy a new apartment, we will ask a lawyer. Here is Israel about to occupy the holiest places for the entire Muslim and Christian world, and no experts, no reason, no rational decision making. Not one of the ministers raises the question, why is it in the interest of Israel to occupy Arab East Jerusalem? Why is it in our interest? Why don't they ask? Because the answer is clear, and it's not in their heads, it's in their guts, it's in their hearts. They act out of passion out of longing, out of 2,000 years, out of history, out of religion. Jerusalem is not something they make a rational decision about. It all comes from the heart. It's not in hindsight that I'm saying this. Again, 6 months prior to that decision, they knew that it's not good for the national interest of Israel because it endangers Israel's character as a Jewish state. So the question is, why does it happen? Of course, there is a tendency to look for the explanation with the Arabs. And that's why I said that you probably had a hard time understanding the Arabs, because they insist on marginal things, marginal in relation to what they lose. A whole generation of Palestinians, in fact, 2 generations of Palestinians has been lost under Israeli occupation. But all they have to do is to say, okay, take Jerusalem. You want to rule Jerusalem, rule Jerusalem. Okay, you want to have the settlements, have the settlements. You don't want to recognize our right of return. Okay, we respect reality. And on the basis of that reality, we get a wonderful independent state. The whole world will pay for it, will sustain us, will support us. But they don't do that. They don't do that. They say, no, we insist. Refugees, Jerusalem, settlements, no. And now they insist that they don't recognize Israel as a Jewish state. It's so foolish. Why? What for? What's the point here? Why risk some agreement, perhaps, on just in order to for a principle, for a word? And of course, they keep hitting Israel with terror, and that is against their own interest because we hit back, and so that gets them nowhere. So these are the Arabs. But we too. We, for example, refuse to recognize that we share the responsibility for the creation of the Arab refugee problem in 1948. And I'm phrasing this very carefully. We share the responsibility for that tragedy, but we don't admit it. Why is it so important to us? We treat this as if it is an existential question. Many countries in the world have admitted historical wrongdoings. Many countries have asked for forgiveness. We don't. We think that it is terribly important. It might shatter the ideological basis of our very existence. We are willing to control 3 million Palestinians, but we turn away any one of them who wants to return home. And we expand the settlements. More and more settlers, Israeli settlers, are moving into the West Bank. We know it is bad. It is bad for the basis of the Zionist ideology. Every settler makes it more difficult to sustain the Jewish majority. Every settler makes it more difficult to reach an agreement. We still do it. And we insist that Jerusalem, the entire city, has to remain under Israeli control. Nobody talks about dividing Jerusalem. Jerusalem will remain one united city. The question is who will control it, who will control the Arab places. We insist that we must control the entire city, including holy places of Muslims and Christians. It's very, very strange, very strange and very, very difficult to explain, because doing all these things, we are giving up chances for an agreement, not necessarily for peace, but chances for agreement, and we are endangering the future of Israel as a Jewish and democratic country. So how do we explain all this? As I said, it is very, very difficult. It is basically irrational. Of course, and I'm not saying this cynically, of course, we are talking about the Holy Land, the land where religion, monotheistic religion, was born for Jews and Christians and Muslims. We all connect our beliefs to this country, and so maybe you can't expect rational behavior in such a country. The whole existence of Israel is a result of an ideology and a dream, a very fantastic dream, a dream that lasted for 2,000 years and became reality. Unbelievable, but it became reality. So this is something that encourages many Israelis to believe that maybe the impossible can be possible, and makes many Israelis go for illusions and fantasies. But there is also fear. Zionism was born out of traumas, 2,000 years of traumatic existence, and just before it became reality, the Holocaust happened. Yesterday was Holocaust Day in Israel, and I don't know if anybody of you ever been to Israel on Holocaust Day. It is quite impressive the way the country commemorates the Holocaust Day. During the day, certain hour, you hear sirens blowing on every street of the country, and everybody stands still for 2 minutes. Nothing, everything stops, life stops, and everybody does it. Drivers do it, drivers on highways do it. They stop the car, everybody walks out of the car, stands still, the siren, which if you are in the car, you hear it on the radio. So I think that you cannot understand Israel without understanding that the Holocaust is a very essential element of the Israeli identity. The feeling that we may experience another Holocaust, the feeling that it is the destiny of Israel to prevent another Holocaust, the feeling that we are all Holocaust survivors. There are polls again and again being done in Israel. You go to a high school, you ask the kids, and 8 out of 10 high school kids in Israel will tell you, yes, I am a Holocaust survivor. Why are you a Holocaust survivor? You are 18 years old, you live in Israel. Your parents were born in Israel. Your grandparents came from Morocco. Why are you a Holocaust survivor? I am a Holocaust survivor. That's how they feel. And the Arabs don't understand that. They refuse to understand it. Arab countries and Palestinians, they refuse to understand what the Holocaust means for Israel. To them, it is Zionist propaganda. This is what the crazy president of Iran is saying. It is Zionist propaganda. It never happened. And I think it's very unfortunate. They don't teach the Holocaust in their schools. They ban movies about the Holocaust. They know nothing about the Holocaust. And I think it's very unfortunate because you cannot understand Israel without understanding the role of the Holocaust in our psyche. And unless you understand your enemy, you also can't make peace with your enemy. On the eve of the Six-Day War, which I mentioned, we were afraid of Nasser. And this is why we decided to attack Egypt. The war with Egypt started as a result of fear, a genuine Holocaust fear. Can be documented. There's no question about it. And today we fear Iran. Very real fear of Iran. We know nothing about Iran. We know nothing about Iranian politics. We don't know who is strong, who is weak, who is talking, why they are talking, what they are doing. It looks obviously weird to us that a country would arrange an official state-sponsored international conference of Holocaust deniers, but we are afraid. Here's a president of a very strong country developing an atomic bomb, saying that it is his aim to wipe Israel off the globe and denying the Holocaust. This is not something we can ignore, not after the Holocaust. And so we fear. Once again, we fear. There are some other elements, irrational elements, which we carry in us as part of our tradition. We believe, for example, that we are the chosen people. This is what our tradition tells us, which means that we are better than other people, which means that nobody can preach morality to us. The problem is that many other countries also regard Israel as a country that is obliged to follow higher moral standards than other countries. And that is a problem. Many countries judge us by other moral standards. And we carry in us the belief that the whole world is against us. Again, this is an historical thought. Jews have always been persecuted, and the whole world is against us in Israel. Very often we tend to say that when somebody criticizes the government of Israel, he does so out of anti-Semitic motivation. Sometimes it is true, but very often it is not. Still, we believe that the whole world is against us. In reality, Israel enjoys tremendous support all over the world, in governments and countries and populations, but we believe that it is not, and that, of course, encourages us to fence ourselves into some kind of tribal togetherness and do whatever we think is right and shut ourselves off advice from other countries. And we also carry in us a traditional belief that the more they torment us, the stronger we become. This is something we read in the Pesach Haggadah. And for us, it is an everyday existential belief. And that, of course, encourages us not to compromise, because we will get stronger. Torment us, we will get stronger. I think that the reason why it is so difficult to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that because it is not a conflict about land, or not merely about land, it is not merely about water, it is not merely about security, it is not even merely about mutual recognition. It is a conflict about identity. Both Israelis and Palestinians define their national identity by the country, all of it. And so every compromise requires that we give up part of our identity. And apparently, we are not mature enough to do that, neither Palestinians nor Israelis. So at this point, of course, the question comes up, where does that leave us, leave the chances for peace? And at this point, I also have to decide whether I want to send you home more optimistic or more pessimistic. In America, you always are expected to end optimistically. The United States has the ability to make Israel follow a more rational policy. The question is whether or not she wants to do that. Many presidents tried to do that and failed. One of them who succeeded was, of course, Jimmy Carter, who more or less forced on Israel the peace agreement with Egypt, and it worked. I sometimes feel that what we need is an American president who would save us from ourselves and from our fears, from our self-righteousness. And in this connection, I would put it to you that there is something Friends of Israel can do for Israel, and that would be to distinguish between the position of the government of Israel and between Israel as a country. It is not the same thing, but usually in America, when people want to be friendly to Israel, they support what the government of Israel is saying. This is something you would never dream of doing for your own country. You know that this or that president is not representing the national interest, and for Israel, you don't do that. So I would suggest that you consider the possibility that Prime Minister Netanyahu at this point does not represent the real interest of Israel, because he is still holding on to a basically irrational ideology. And in the name of that ideology, he refuses at this point to say that he supports the two-state solution, division of the country between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. So consider the following situation. Netanyahu and Obama get on some collision course, and it is not Netanyahu who represents the true interest of Israel, but Obama. Obama has repeatedly said that he supports the two-state solution, and I obviously think that this is the right thing. But I hope that, in contrast to President Bush, Obama doesn't fall in love with that formula. The problem under Bush was that he gave us diplomatic fictions. There was no roadmap. There was no peace process. Nothing really happened. I think it couldn't have happened. And I think it was very damaging that for 8 years we got ourselves into that illusion, and in the meantime the situation deteriorated. It couldn't have happened because at the present time, there is no solution to the conflict. And in that regard, I think I represent most of the Israelis, in contrast to my image as somebody who does not represent the majority of Israelis. We don't really have a solution to the refugee problem. We don't have a solution to the problem of the settlement. We don't have a solution to the problem of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been a problem without solution for the last 3,000 years, and it may well remain a problem without solution for the next 3,000 years. Former Prime Minister Barak was once photographed on the beach on vacation, reading a book that contained 200 solutions to the problem of Jerusalem. So if you have a problem that has 200 solutions, well, obviously it's very difficult to solve. So I think that at this point, it is not helpful to look for a final peace agreement. At this point, I think that we have a conflict that can be managed in a more rational way, and this is the best we can do, and we can do it quite well, aiming not at a final peace agreement, not at a solemn ceremony on the White House lawn, aiming at a very simple, very limited aim, that is to make life more livable for both Israelis and Palestinians. That means that Gaza needs immediate help. It needs to be rebuilt. There are many people who are still injured. That means that Gaza should be opened, should be open contact between Gaza and Egypt, between Gaza and the West Bank. The West Bank should be more open. We don't need that many checkpoints. We don't need that many checkpoints on the road. We don't need to harass people. There are some security measures which are needed and some harassment which is not needed. If you make if a 5-year-old boy sees how an 18-year-old soldier makes his father take off his pants at the checkpoint, this is the next terrorist. And these are things which are unnecessary. And of course, we must stop the expansion of the settlements. So I think that what we need at the moment is not a big statement, not a formula, not another fiction. What we need is a more decent and fairer management of the conflict. And I believe that it is possible with the help of America. And in that sense, I'm more optimistic than I might have sounded until now. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks very much, Tom. A follow-up on a couple of points that you made. Sorry, that's probably me. No. Why don't we leave that out of your pocket, because it'll probably just hit the microphone.
All right. This is quite terrible. Is that Chinese torture or what?
Yeah, I guess. The CIA organized it.
Right. I read about it in the New York Times today.
Okay. You said that most Israelis no longer believe in peace. And that's a pretty sobering message for this audience. But I'd like to ask you, if you were putting yourself in a Palestinian shoe, or in an Arab shoe more broadly elsewhere in the region, what message would you take from that, from your observation about Israelis, that most Israelis no longer believe in peace? Should the Palestinians believe in it?
They don't. I'm really not an expert on Palestinians, and as you know, Israeli journalists for a long time are no longer allowed to enter the West Bank, and so it's difficult to talk to Palestinians, but my impression is that young Palestinians no longer believe in peace just the way Israelis don't believe in peace. And again, the reason why young Israelis don't believe in peace anymore is not because they don't want peace, but because they have tried it. They look, as I said, I grew up to believe in peace, and they look at somebody of my generation and say, but for 40 years you've been talking about peace. Where's the peace you promised us? There is no peace. And we tried it. We had Oslo, we had other agreements. The Palestinians reacted with intifada. First intifada, second intifada, more terrorism and more buses blowing up. There is no partner. Then the Hamas took control of Gaza immediately after Israel had evacuated all the settlements in Gaza, and they started shooting into this small town called Sderot, which is a really tiny town, very poor town. And the Palestinians from Gaza fire. At the beginning, they were rather primitively handmade rockets, something you can make in the backyard or in the garage. Now they are more sophisticated. But this is constantly shelling a town, and life in Sderot is impossible. I mean, you can't go to school because you don't know. What happens there in reality is that every few hours, they get a warning alarm all over town, and they have about 25 seconds to look for shelter. There are shelters, but you can't live that way. You can't have school that way. Every few hours, some crazy Palestinian fires a rocket into your town. So this is a long time, going on for a long time. And so this is what has determined, I think, has influenced so many people to lose faith in the possibility of peace, which means that young people now grow up knowing that their children may well have to fight another war. And you know, this is the reality in Israel today, and I think that you should know it. I mean, it's not enough to say, yes, we pray for peace, we want peace, and we do everything we can for peace, and it's the Arabs who don't want peace. Yes, it's all true, but the reality is that most Israelis don't believe in peace anymore.
Do you think President Obama knows that? Is that something that American leaders hear or learn? Hang on, just before you answer, can I ask you, can we put up the house lights just a little bit so we can see the audience better, please? And would you mind putting the slide of the map up as well? Sorry to interrupt you, but that might be a little helpful. Okay, good.
I don't really presume to know what he knows,
but I mean, is that message getting through in the United States?
I think that...
Or is there a disconnect of information about what we as Americans know about what's going on in Israel?
No, as far as I know, Americans are very, very well informed, not only about what the Israeli government wants and does, but also what the Israeli public thinks. Yes, I'm sure that they know it, and they also understand in Washington that this is why it was so easy for many people to vote for Netanyahu, who does not offer hope for peace. He does not offer a peace plan. He just says, you know, we will be strong and we will defend ourselves, and it is a security. So people did not feel that anything is missing there, because they know why he's not talking about peace. They don't believe in peace. So this was, of course, only one reason why they elected him. The other thing was they elected him by default, because the acting prime minister may well be in jail next year. So obviously they voted for Netanyahu. But the fact that a political party does not offer its own way to peace is taken for granted. So, as I say, this is a relatively new development.
Forgive me, I want to ask a question that some of our students asked Tom earlier in class that I think you'll all appreciate hearing the answer to. You were asked by several students earlier about young people in Israel, young voters, young members of the military, the youngest generation, those going into high school and so on. What is the political demographic of that group now? Are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic? Are they politically dovish or liberal? Are they politically hawkish or conservative?
Most young Israelis they're not conservative, but most young Israelis are very hawkish. Most young Israelis don't believe in peace. Most young Israelis tend to vote for right-wing, hawkish parties in Israel. My own son, I sometimes ask him, do you believe in peace? But he says, I already told you that I don't. And the question then rises, so why do you stay in Israel? Why does a young person who knows that there will be no peace, why do you plan to live in Israel, raise a family in Israel, have kids in Israel? The reason is that that's home. And that's, I think, the best indication for what I tried to explain to you before, that there is such a thing as an Israeli identity. Only 60 years after independence, we already have a second generation of people who feel that this is where they belong. They don't get up in the morning and ask themselves, what have I done today for the Zionist ideology? No, they take it for granted. And still, they don't believe in peace. So it's a very strange thing. That's one of the reasons why it is so difficult to understand, because the rational thing would be, well, if you don't believe in peace, then, and if you are, like my son is a student in electronic engineering, why don't you look for a job in Canada? It's very easy to... Actually, I asked him that once, and the next night I found him on the internet. The Canadian Embassy in Israel has a really nice site where they encourage people to go, and they tell you how many points you need for that. If you are young, if you are single, if you have a profession, and he got lots of points. And I said, so, are you going? And he said, no, I'm not going. I'm here. So, again, rationally thinking, this would be... Then there is a whole group of young Israelis who are just indifferent. And they are the Americanized Israelis. They are in Tel Aviv, if you want. There's a big difference, symbolic difference, if you want, between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Two worlds. Jerusalem and Tel Aviv are two different worlds. Jerusalem is a very religious, political, fanatic town, very intolerant, 5,000 years old and built on rock. Tel Aviv is about 100 years old, built on sand. Easy life in Tel Aviv. Americanized. Very much in the tradition, in the spirit of the American now culture. They don't live for history, they don't live for the future. They live now and they have a good life, and they are cynical about politics, they're cynical about the Arabs. They don't want to see Arabs. They don't see many Arabs in Tel Aviv. So I think that these are the two major groups. You don't have a strong group of peace activists among young people in Israel. The peace movement in Israel hardly exists anymore. So this is probably what you can expect in the future. This is the future generation of Israelis who take it for granted that there will be no peace.
So Netanyahu's party and his leadership have keyed into sort of future-looking demographic in Israel.
I think so, yes. I think that is correct, yes.
And just a final question on this, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So tell us about the opposite end of the demographic spectrum. You told us about young people in Israel. Is there an older generation in Israel who is still, I'll use the word clinging to what you have described as sort of an older view of things? I mean,
like me, yes. There is a generation of people, many people who were active in Peace Now movement. There were sometimes demonstrations in Tel Aviv where the place that now carries the name of Rabin in Tel Aviv, the major place, like 250,000 people would come to a peace demonstration. Unthinkable today, not because they are against.
I mean, you couldn't get 250?
You couldn't get 200,000 people demonstrate for peace today. So, but yes, some people grew up to believe in it, and they're very sorry that it didn't happen. They blame, obviously, the right and whatever you blame, but that's the reality.
And that change has just occurred in the last less than 15 years, really.
Yes, I would say so. I would say that this is the major reason why this occurred is the repeated acts of terrorism, of Palestinian terrorism. Everybody knows that Palestinian terrorism does not endanger the existence of the State of Israel. It endangers me. I have to decide whether I give my car keys to my son to go out and spend an evening in a nightclub in Tel Aviv or not. And I don't want to think that. I don't want to be constantly reminded that I can't go on a bus because it may blow up. I was once sitting with friends of mine in a cafe, and we were talking like liberal Israeli peaceniks are talking. We talked human rights, we talked Palestinian state, we talked withdrawal from the territories, dismantling the settlements, everything was nice. We were lucky to go before the cafe blew up. So you feel stupid. Who am I talking to? What am I talking about? Who is my partner? Even if they want peace, they can't control the terrorists. They probably do, but maybe they don't control them. What difference does it make? What's the chance? So I think that this is the major reason, the impact of terrorism. That's the danger of terrorism in every country. Everybody who studies terrorism know it. It's not endangering the national existence of anybody. It endangers the willingness and the ability of individual people to think and act rationally. So I think this is the tremendous effect, and it's of course very, very damaging to the national interest of the Palestinians also.
Tom, I mentioned to you that before we came in that we published this program live on the internet, and we have a question from an internet viewer at this point already, who is asking whether you believe a two-state solution, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state living side by side in peace together, is achievable.
It is much more difficult to achieve today than it was 15 years ago because so many additional settlers live in the territories. It is much more difficult to achieve today than 15 years ago because the conflict has become much more religious on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side, which means that it is much, much more difficult to solve rationally. And yes, I still do believe that eventually this is the best solution. But of course, it is not the only solution. We can take Gaza and annex it to Egypt. We can take the West Bank and annex it to Jordan and make Jordan a Palestinian state. Nowhere is it written that the Hashemite dynasty must rule forever in Jordan. Sometimes people come to Israel and say, why don't you just live together in a binational state? Jews and Arabs live together happily ever after. The answer is that most Israelis and most Arabs don't want that. It's also unfair to ask Palestinians to give up something they don't even have yet. Once they have their state and and get organized and experience self-determination and record their achievements and make their mistakes, maybe then you can tell them, you know what, it's better to live in one state. What do I know? Perhaps. But yes, I think that the two-state solution is still the ultimate solution. And in the meantime, we must not just wait until it happens. We need to take immediate steps to make life more livable, manage the conflict in the meantime.
All right, your turn. Let's take a question from a student first. Yes, up here. Okay, question is the rule for mandatory military service in Israel, does it reinforce among young people the us against them, the world is all against us kind of mentality?
First of all, one thing which many of you may not know is that today 1 of every 2 Israelis doesn't go to the army. There are all kinds of ways to avoid military service if you really want to, legal ways. And the other thing is, yes, I think that it does enforce it because the major task of the Israeli army today is to rule the territories. The major enemy is the Palestinian population, and I make no distinction between Palestinian terrorists and other Palestinians. Very often, rightfully so. You stand at a checkpoint, a car comes, what do you know? Is it, will it blow up, or is it just an innocent car? So I think that this is also a reason why the Israeli army is not doing so well anymore in the wars. For example, in the last war in Lebanon, it was not fighting so well because it is not mainly a fighting army anymore. It is more of an occupation gendarmerie. And the major task is to control the Palestinian population. But I definitely do think that this is something, but I also think that very often this is something soldiers bring with them. Young people already bring that attitude with them when they join the army. So it is not that the army is indoctrinating them to hate the Arabs. They bring that with them when they come to the army, very often.
Okay, question from a non-student. Yes, sir?
First of all, thank you for your presentation. It's very great. You hit on a very good subject when you asked, do people like Ralph and myself, I'm from Palestine, inside Israel. I'm one of the Arabs who live there.
Where are you from?
Acre.
From Akka. If you were from Sakhnin, I would tell the story of the Sakhnin soccer game, but unfortunately you are not. Okay.
And the question was, are there people who believe in peace in Israel? And I think our generation, I was born in 56, we were 45, are no longer, they're leaving because the situation has developed where we have a war outside, we have Gaza, and we have Netanyahu and Lieberman today.
So is your question,
My question to you is, with those issues there, and having our people like you and I believing in peace, do you think the situation that exists right now with Lieberman and Netanyahu, the wall, Gaza, and the problem that is, do you think there's a chance for it, even with Obama being very optimistic?
okay, I think that, hang on, I got to repeat it because the internet audience can't hear it and many of the other people in the audience
Right.
can't hear it. I think the question is basically there are many people, the questioner identified himself as being from Palestine, from a Palestinian city of Akko.
Akko is a town in Israel, actually.
So the question is, there are people who believe in peace, but with Netanyahu and Lieberman and their supporters, is Obama right to be optimistic that there could be a solution, I guess, in the short term?
The good thing about Israeli politics is that Israeli governments don't last very long. So there's always reason to hope for better ones.
Just wait a minute and it'll change.
Right. As I said, I don't think that the big problems have a solution at this point. And it is therefore that I think we should concentrate on making life more livable. This is the best I can do. I mean, to manage the conflict in a more rational way, to manage it in a way that would make life more livable, not to let the situation deteriorate in the name of some abstract, fictitious, diplomatic formula, such as the roadmap or the peace process. You know, according to Bush, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should have ended by December 31st last, which was a Wednesday. He never said if it's before lunch or after lunch. So I don't think that brings us anywhere. We need to, there's so many things we can do just to make life more livable. That's the best formulation I can give you.
Forgive me, I'm going to expand your question just a little bit to bring out a point that you mentioned earlier, but not so far this evening. You've talked about making life more livable, and you explained a few options in that regard in your remarks. Netanyahu has talked about reaching some sort of agreement with Syria.
Yes.
Would it be a positive thing? Would it move things in the right direction? Even though it wouldn't necessarily deal with or solve the Palestinian problem, would it help if Obama and Netanyahu and the Syrian leadership decided, okay, we're going to settle our piece of the puzzle?
Yes. As I said, I'm always wrong with my predictions, but I think that it is very possible to reach peace with Syria. It is relatively easy to reach peace with Syria. Why? Because it is about land, it is about strategy, it is about water, it is not about feelings. There are no holy places on the Golan Heights. It is not about identity. It is a very easy thing to decide. It's actually a decision, a strategic decision, which the government of Israel has taken many times. Do we exchange the Golan for peace with Syria? Syria raised all kinds of conditions which the government of Israel decided not to accept. I mean, this is a perfectly reasonable decision. So we decided not to accept these conditions. But the Syrians are talking to Israel, Israelis are talking to Syria, and we haven't agreed yet. But it is not something which looks so difficult to do like achieving peace between Israel and the Palestinians. I think that Netanyahu may well want to be the prime minister who made peace with Syria, just as Begin was the prime minister from the same Likud party who was the prime minister who made peace with Egypt. And I think that President Obama may want to be the American president who brought that about. And I think that it makes perfect sense to get Syria away from the Iranian camp. So yes, it makes sense that we will have peace between Israel and Syria. I think it will be wonderful, but I don't think that it will be a miracle. It is something that is politically, diplomatically, strategically feasible. So it might happen.
Okay, question from a student? Question from a student? Yes.
I have a question about the notion of rationality you're using. You seem to be using some kind of calculus of political economy in it, but cultural anthropologists have shown for a while that people can make rational decisions that take into account social status and cultural traditions. So is it better when trying to analyze the situation with Israelis and Palestinians to understand decisions based on identity as being, in some sense, rational? Does that lead towards a more constructive and useful analysis?
Okay, I'm going to have a hard time paraphrasing that, but the questioner is basically referring to Tom's references earlier to the irrationality of many of the factors, religion, identity, and so on that he mentioned earlier, and asking whether really the question of identity, whether it would help if the question of identity were seen as a rational kind of decision-making and framework. Would it make any difference?
It wouldn't make any difference in the situation. It would make it more difficult to explain, because if everything is rational, then why are we behaving the way we do? I need that distinction between rational and irrational considerations in order to make some order into that very, very confused situation, and in order to explain it to myself. But I understand your point, but still I think that if we know what our national interest is, or if we define our national interest, which is, as I said, defined constitutionally in Israel. We don't have a constitution, but we have constitutional laws. And the official definition of Israel's national aim is to be, and that's the way we define ourselves, a Jewish and democratic country. And if we constantly do things that contradict that aim, then I think that we are doing something irrational. The rational thing is to promote our national aim. And it's not an irrational aim. It's quite rational. It makes sense to be a Jewish and democratic country. Difficult, but possible. But we are doing everything to prevent that national aim from becoming reality. So to me, that is an irrational behavior.
Okay, we got another question from Second Life on the internet. Questioner is asking, she's interested in your views on the role of the media in Israel today and whether that's changed. Doesn't say from what period of change. You mentioned that Israelis don't listen to the news every hour anymore and they don't read as many newspapers. Is the media helping or hurting the problem in Israel these days, or some other alternative?
The media is less political and I think less responsible and less courageous than in the past. We are still considered a country with good media, professional media. We still have some good newspapers, we have good television, we have good radio, responsible. But I think that all too often the media accepts the realities which the government present. For example, if the government says the war in Gaza is needed, most of the media will support that. 3 weeks later, you will read lots of articles and see lots of television reporting how wrong it was to start the war in Gaza. But you learned nothing new. You knew it on the first day. Why support it? Oh, well, we support it because we are patriotic. When the country goes to war, it's our duty to support a war. We are by far less sensitive today to human rights violations.
Less sensitive.
Less sensitive to human rights violations. One reason is almost technical. It's no longer possible for journalists to visit the occupied territories. It's forbidden to enter the West Bank and Gaza. But that's not the major reason. The major reason is that most readers don't care so much anymore for violations of human rights. Most readers believe that somehow the situation is under control, and they don't want to hear anymore about violations of human rights, about harassment, about things that happen on the checkpoints, and about ambulances that can't cross to Jerusalem with people. And so I think that in general, the Israeli media is much weaker today as a media, is much less responsible, and is not so good anymore as it used to be.
Tom, do Israelis pay attention to the relatively new phenomenon of transnational Arab media? Do they watch Al Jazeera or Al Arabiya? And if so, do they just dismiss it as, irrelevant, or do they see the Arab point of view through that format?
First of all, they dismiss it as Arab propaganda, which I think is correct. But during the war in Gaza, this was the first war where Israeli journalists were not allowed to go with the army. All the Israeli press and all the international press was left outside Gaza. The army entered Gaza, no journalists. So many people exchanged news or rumors on the internet, and many people watched Al Jazeera. As you know, there is an English Al Jazeera, which I think is somewhat better than the Arabic one. I don't speak Arabic, but I hear that the Arabic Al Jazeera is more propagandistic and the English Al Jazeera is more journalistic. So many people actually watched because you want to know what's going on. So Al Jazeera will tell you because they have their sources in Gaza, and I don't think that's a very healthy thing, but this happened for a while.
Okay, question from a non-student. Yes, ma'am?
I think I'm hearing you say two different things, and I'd like you to reconcile them for me. On the one side, you say that with regard to Gaza, that when Israel pulled out
Okay, I'll try to paraphrase briefly for those who couldn't hear. The questioner is asking you to reconcile two things she heard you say. One is that there is no partner to talk to for peace negotiations, and the other is if we negotiate with Syria and, as she said, give away some more land like Israel did in Gaza, then everything will be okay. How do you reconcile those two views, or do you see them as not contradictory?
No, these are very different issues. First of all, when I said there is no partner, I was trying to reflect what most Israelis feel. I mean, I say I, but most Israelis say there is no partner. I think we should negotiate with Hamas.
Should or should not?
Should, yes. I think we should negotiate with Hamas. They are not nice people, the Hamas. No, they are not nice people, but they are the enemy we have. You can't choose your enemies. You talk to the enemy that presents itself on the ground. And I think that they're also a genuine national movement. They are not merely a terrorist organization. Yes, they are. And if they are, you also talk to them. All countries always claim that they will never talk to terrorist organizations, and all countries always do talk to terrorist organizations. So I think, and by the way, we do talk to the Hamas all the time, because there are so many everyday matters that have to be regulated. Entering Gaza, leaving Gaza, they need to get oil, they need to get electricity, there are telephone communications, constant contacts with the people who are in control in Gaza, which happens to be the Hamas. So we might as well talk to the Hamas. We will not reach peace with the Hamas, I think, but we may reach agreement on concrete problems and reduce the tension and make it at least somehow better, improve it somehow for Palestinians and for Israelis. And by the way, it's a result of our contacts with the Hamas that for several weeks now they have stopped shooting at Sderot, that tiny little town. So it's not that you can't reach pragmatic arrangements, pragmatic agreements on specific problems. This you can do. But I don't think that we have an answer to the big problems that make the conflict, because even the most moderate Palestinians and the most moderate Israelis are too far away. Very different situation with Syria. There, it is not about emotions. It is not about history. It is not about God. It's about strategy. What is better? Is it better to control the Golan, or is it better to have a formal peace agreement with Syria? It's a relatively easy matter. It's not impossible. And we've had talks with the Syrians several times. We didn't agree. At the end, we didn't agree. But we didn't agree on specific strategic things, not about recognition or about identity. So these are, I think, separate issues, and I hope I reconciled them for you.
A question from a student? Question from a student?
Over there.
Right here, yes?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Israeli Arabs are discouraged or not allowed to be part of the Israeli army, the military. And you were speaking earlier to our class about the need to bring Israeli Arabs into the country and to not marginalize them. And I was wondering if you thought that maybe doing that through the military, if it's a viable reason, if there's desire for it on the Israeli Arab parts. I just wanted you to comment on that.
Okay, the question is, would it be helpful, Israeli Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, that is, Arabs who are Israeli citizens, are not currently allowed to serve in the Israeli military. Would it be helpful if they were allowed or encouraged to serve in the Israeli military? Would it modify or assist Israel in negotiating with the Arabs more broadly, with the Palestinians more broadly?
Okay. It's not that they are not allowed to serve in the Israeli army. Some Arabs serve in the Israeli army. Bedouins serve in the Israeli army. Palestinians who belong to the Druze religion serve in the Israeli army. Muslim and Christian Palestinian Israelis don't serve in the army, not because they are not allowed to, but because it is mutually understood that they have a big problem serving in the Israeli army. You know, Israeli Arabs are people whose country is at war with their nation. So what do you expect? Israeli Arab, what? To betray their nations, to betray their neighbors, to what? To lead to civil war in the Arab community in Israel. Some do, some don't, some are traitors, some are not. The general understanding is that the best thing for Arabs is not to serve in the army. That's what most Arabs want, and that is a very reasonable thing, that they can't serve in the Israeli army, most of them. And so they don't. They can perform something called national duties. They can work communal work which is legally recognized, and that would get them the same rights which soldiers who are released from the army have. These are rights, mostly financial rights, better mortgages, better all kinds of support from the government, and things which former soldiers get, and Israeli Arabs don't, because they haven't served in the army. They haven't served in the army because they are Arabs. So that's a clear discrimination against a clearly defined national group. You can't say it otherwise. So I don't think that serving in the army is the best way to integrate Arabs into the Israeli society. I think that there's nothing Israeli Arabs want more than become equal citizens of Israel. And they are not. Legally, even, they are not. There are some laws that don't apply to Arabs, and there are many forms of discrimination. Still, I think it's safe to say that most Israeli Arabs enjoy better lives than most Arabs in the Arab world, and certainly than most Palestinians. And the worst thing that can be done for Israel, and of course for the Arabs, is to encourage bigotry and hatred, as this new Lieberman party is doing. What Mr. Lieberman, who is now Israeli foreign minister, is advocating, by the way, is new borders for Israel that would exclude most of the Israeli Arabs and make them take away their Israeli citizenship and make them part of a Palestinian state that doesn't even exist. And to judge by the experience of Gaza, you know, it's not really a pleasant thing to stop being an Israeli citizen and become a citizen of Palestine. So that's the idea. What it means is, let's get rid of the Arabs. And I think that's a very, very dangerous sentiment, and that's really playing with fire. And we did have communal clashes, violent clashes between Arabs and Jews in Israel, even recently, even in Akko recently. So I think this is a very, very delicate thing. By the way, what I'm saying to you now as the danger to the stability of the society is something the Israeli Security Service is also saying. So it's not a dovish, leftist, liberal thing to say. The Israeli Security Service in Israel, which is very, very powerful, specifically concerning the treatment of Arabs, they also say, be very, very careful. This is playing with fire. This might erupt in violence. So in between the Lieberman attitude and making the Arabs Israeli soldiers, I think there's a very, very broad spectrum of things that can be done in order to increase the equality of Arabs and make them integrate into the Israeli society as equal citizens.
All right. Before we say thanks to Tom Segev, I just want to re-announce our program for 2 weeks from tonight. May 6th, right here in Mitchell Hall, we'll welcome the Consul General of Israel, the Honorable Daniel Kuttner. That's May 6th at 7:30 p.m. A reminder that if you're not already receiving emails about programs like this, please print your email address clearly on one of the bright orange sheets out in the lobby, and we'll make sure to include you not only for this year, but for next year as well. Now, please, let's thank our speaker tonight, Tom Segev.
Thank you very much.
From Israel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.